Good morning. Thank you for coming to this morning's presentation, which is one of 9 this week. This is the busiest week of the Canada semester, 9 total events. We do have a film tonight at 7, Bon Cop, Bad Cop, which is going to be introduced by the Canadian Consul General's office. And after the film, they're going to do a little talk back with the audience, discussing the film. 4 events tomorrow. Presentations at 10, 11, and 1, and then 2 talks on Thursday. Nothing on Friday. The good thing about having people from the Canadian Consul General's office come is they bring swag. You can get pins, U.S. Canada pins, U.S. Ontario pins. We have Mr. Earl Provost with us, who is the agent general in Chicago representing the province of Ontario, and his assistant, Carson Markley. They brought candy bars, Canadian candy bars. So there's, I think, 5 different kinds. There's a coffee crisp, which you should try on your way out, caramilk, crispy crunch, and Wonder Bar. I also saw some Kit Kats on there. I'm going to keep these 4 to try later. Today's speaker is Colleen Duke. She's a great friend of Missouri Southern. When we did a Canada semester 15 years ago, she was very helpful, and she came to Joplin then and brought the Consul General with her 15 years ago. She is a senior foreign policy and diplomacy services officer in Chicago. Fancy title. Well-deserved. Her areas of focus include academic and cultural relations, public affairs, communications and digital media, agriculture policy, security and defense, and human rights issues, which is going to tie in with this presentation. Prior to joining Global Affairs Canada, Colleen worked at a number of museums in Chicago and Washington, D.C. She is a BA in art history and economics. That's a strange combination, art history and economics, from the University of Chicago, and an MBA from Northwestern University. So once again, let's welcome Colleen Duke.
Thanks, Dr. Stebbins. And it's rare that anyone ever notices that, yes, my BA is a very weird combo. Tomorrow we're going to be doing a panel discussion called So You Want to Be a Diplomat? And it was the easiest one for all of us to put together because we're going to be talking about ourselves and our careers and our career paths. And so if you want to hear how you go and get a degree in economics and art history at the same time, I might share that story. Thank you so much for coming today. This was the most challenging presentation to put together of all of them that we're doing over the next few days. There's a lot of information. I'm going to try to get through it. And I appreciate you giving us the time. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement that the land that we are on today is the original homelands of the Kaskaskia, the Kickapoo, the Osage, the Ochechi-Sakawan, the Ogsapla Mazo, and the Caddo people. And I acknowledge the importance of their lifeways, their history, and their presence. So a bunch of disclaimers for this presentation, because this is fairly unusual for what we normally do. So I am not Indigenous. I am not, in fact, Canadian. I am an American who works for Canada. So the information I'm sharing today comes from a variety of sources, including the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, different departments within the Government of Canada, Indigenous sources, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's a very broad overview of Canada's Indigenous people and the relationship with non-Indigenous Canadians and the government. So we're going to be focused on that. I'm going to be using terms like Indian and Eskimo. They were used in the past and are still active in some instances as a legal term in Canada, even though they're not terms that we would normally use anymore. But because they are legal terms, I will be continuing to use them. I'll be using both Indigenous words and English versions. I'm trying to keep as true to the Indigenous language as I am capable of doing. And this is a tough history to hear. Indigenous people and culture in Canada is very varied and vibrant today. I encourage you to explore it. Because I am focusing on just the government relationship, it's going to be some tough stories, but there's so much more. So I hope this just sort of opens the door to your curiosity. All right, let's rock and roll. So what I'm going to try to cover in the time we have is who are the Indigenous people of Canada, because it is a bit different than the United States. We're going to talk about colonization and its impacts on Indigenous people and reconciliation. So I'm going to try to summarize Indigenous history and life, which is impossible to do writ large in our time. But this is how I try to break it down in creating this presentation for you today. So Indigenous is a sweeping term, and it includes all people across Canada's. They have distinct cultures, traditions, lifeways, histories, and relationships with each other, with Canadian settlers and the Canadian government. And it's important not to think of Indigenous people as people from the past. This is true in the United States as well as Canada. Indigenous people are alive and well, living in cities and towns and rural areas. And you guys are right next door to Oklahoma, so you have more cognizance of that because there are many Indigenous people living in Oklahoma. The population stats for Canada: there are 1.8 million people who identify as Indigenous in the country. 28% are under the age of 25. So they're a very young and fast-growing demographic in the country. And they're all connected by their survival throughout the last 500 years, connection with their lands and their work to keep their languages alive and their cultures vital in a contemporary world. As you see, there's 3 main groups that I'm going to touch on because it's important and they're distinct. First Nations. So we would use the term Native American. First Nations is a very general term. Mostly you refer to someone's specific named nation. First Nations people define themselves as members of a specific nation or a community within a nation. So examples would be Mohawk, Chippewan, or Haida. They all have distinct languages and cultures and kinship relationships and traditional territories. So we're talking hundreds of groups that define themselves in their own ways. They're very diverse, many different points of view, different kinds of communities, different histories across the country. I like maps a lot, so that gives you a sense of the distribution and where concentrations are. And as just an example, so we have the Haida people in British Columbia, the Dene in the Northwest Territories, the Cree in Saskatchewan, the Algonquin, who are actually in Ontario, the Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, and Mohawk in Quebec. I was very deliberate with these pictures to try to emphasize that Indigenous people are present. One of the things that I do at the consulate is I am the liaison to the Indigenous community in Chicago. It came about during COVID. I was working on the land acknowledgement statement for our office and engaged with a number of people in the local community and learned that Chicago has one of the largest urban populations of Native Americans in the United States. So in my building relationships with them, they have raised my sensitivity to what people think or don't think about Native Americans. And the big one is that they're gone. So I tried in putting together these graphics to emphasize, like, they're all still here. And just because someone doesn't sound Indigenous or look Indigenous doesn't mean they're not. And they're everywhere. So First Nations can live on reserve, which is the Canadian term for basically a reservation. Communities on Crown land, so government-owned land, or live off reserve. They may or may not have legal status under the Indian Act. I will get into the Indian Act at a later point. They may be registered members of a band or nation, maybe not. Again, diversity is the key to this, and communities can vary. small, lots of urban populations. Crown land, just to touch on that because it's an unusual term for you, it's land that's owned by the provincial government, and about 52.6% of Canada is crown land. And as I mentioned, the Indian Act I will touch on later. Inuit. So these are the indigenous people of the Arctic. They also live in Greenland and Russia and in the United States. Underneath the syllabic, that is Inuktitut, which is their written language. It was invented by the Inuit Cultural Institution of Canada in the 1970s and is widely used. Now, many live in, and I'm hoping I practiced these words. Hopefully I'll get this right. They live in Inuit Nunangat, which is defined as the land, water, and ice of the Inuit in Canada. And I thought that definition was very interesting and very telling of their lifeways. The territory of Nunavut, which you see is the blue area, was established in 1999. It's 36% of Canada's landmass and 50% of its coastline. And it's made up of not only, but primarily Inuit people. But it's the largest territory, and there's, I believe the number is about 33,000 people living in basically 1/3 of Canada's landmass. So Nunavut means our land in Inuktitut, and 3/4 of Inuit live in 53 communities across the northern regions. And 1/3 of those residents live in communities of 500 people or less. The Inuit population is rising steadily in Canada's urban centers, particularly Ottawa and Edmonton and Montreal. Oop. Yep, that's right. So I mentioned how a tremendous number of Indigenous people in Canada are young. The median age of the Inuit people is 23 years old. The second largest Indigenous language spoken in Canada is Inuktitut, and that's after Cree. So this is not a language that is in danger of disappearing. The capital of Nunavut, which is depicted here at the bottom, is Iqaluit, and population 7,500. So that is the biggest town in all of Nunavut. And then the woman on the upper left, that is Governor General Mary Simon. She is Canada's head of state. For those of you that weren't at the previous talk, which was also by me, in Canada, the head of the government and the head of state are two different people. In the United States, it's the same person. So the Governor General, who is basically the Crown, King Charles' representative in Canada, is appointed the Governor General, Mary Simon. She is Canada's first Indigenous Governor General. She was born in Quebec. She had an Inuk mother, and her father was English, who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. And she gained national and international recognition for her work on the Arctic and Indigenous issues and for her efforts in advocating for Inuit rights, youth, and culture. And she has been Governor General, I think, for about 3 or 4 years at this point. And her picture hangs in our office, along with the Prime Minister and various ministers in charge of Global Affairs Canada, who I work for. Third population I'd like to introduce you to are the Métis. So the Métis emerged as a distinctive Indigenous people and nation in the historic Northwest of the Northwest Territories during the late 18th century. Métis is the French word for mixed. So it's generally defined as people with a mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, but not exclusively. So there are many other groups in Canada that are First Nations, or such as First Nations or Acadians that also fall into this category. So a lot of it is very much based in geography. And they're sometimes called the children of the fur trade. So basically the fur trappers, the European fur trappers, primarily French, would come out west to gather pelts that they would sell. They would take an Indigenous wife, Métis. The Métis homeland encompasses Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the prairie provinces, sort of in the middle, not quite all the way to the coast, and the northern United States, because of course borders are invisible. And so people do go back and forth. Their flag, shown at the bottom, is the oldest to have originated in Canada, and it represents the two cultures unifying as one. I think what's interesting about the Métis is this is an Indigenous identity that came about because of colonialism. So they speak a language called Mischief, which is a blending of First Nations and colonist languages, a lot of French. There's many different dialects to it. There's also some English and Gaelic in there, a lot of Cree, some Algonquin. So it really is a blending of languages. And their culture also blends traditions of other First Nations, of colonist cultures, and the explorers. The Métis were sort of a mobile population because they were following the animals for the pelts, and so they did not settle for quite a while. As I mentioned, the identity developed during the fur trade. They have roots in the Red River settlement area, which became part of Manitoba. Also in fur trade communities in the northern prairies. One of their most interesting things is the sash. It's very distinctive that is used by the Métis people and in Métis culture, and it's basically a finger woven belt. I remember doing finger weaving as a kid, and you literally like take the yarn on your fingers and make it, and it's about 9 feet long, and you can use it in a bunch of different ways. You can keep your coat closed with it. It could be a scarf, a hat, whatever. The distinctive colors in it, red is for the blood of the Métis that was shed through the years while they were fighting for their rights. Blue is for spirits, green, fertility, white is the connection to the earth and the creator. Yellow is the hope for prosperity, and black is for the dark suppression, period of suppression and the dispossession of Métis land when they were moved off. So you've got your 3 main groups of Indigenous people pre-contact. As I mentioned, nations, they had their own ways of governing themselves, their own architecture, housing, justice system, spiritual practices. And it, as you saw, there's hundreds of different groups, so it was quite diverse. When the French and the English came over, they set up a bunch of treaties with the people that they encountered. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was one of the first ones, and it was made up of 6 independent Iroquois nations that came together under the Great Law of Peace. And they had elected representatives of each of those nations that would come together and discuss their challenges and work together to avoid misunderstanding and war. This confederacy amongst each other was used as one model of governance that inspired the political systems that developed in the United States and in Canada in the 18th century as we were beginning to form our own nations. So we use these as an example for what we should do. The Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee also made a treaty, which has the really beautiful name, so I wanted to mention it, called The Dish with One Spoon, which brought both groups together and agreed for them to share and protect the land. And then the Blackfoot Confederacy, which was the Blackfoot, the Blood, and the Piegan nations in the Great Plains region of Canada and the United States came together, and they shared a common nomadic lifestyle based on the movement of the bison. And so they relied on each other for sustenance. So these are the treaties that they made with each other, but the settlers came and saw these agreements and used them as examples. The Inuit were based on oral history, and there's quite a bit of evidence that from their oral history and traditions that they could trace their history back far enough that later investigators could find the shipwrecks of explorers in the Arctic. So there was record keeping, whether it was written or oral, that the incoming settlers did rely on it with the early relationships with the native peoples. And in many of these indigenous cultures, actions and agreements and decisions are undertaken and made for the well-being of 7 generations to come. So they're looking far down the road when they are, when they're teaching, when they're building their knowledge, and when they're developing relationships with one another. Contact. So very quickly, because like I said, it's a lot to cover. So there were sporadic explorations by the Vikings on the east coast of Canada. I think there might be one community that stayed. It's very hard to find the evidence, and the archaeologists and anthropologists are still working on it today. But there was some movement back and forth before the other Europeans came. French were the first Europeans with a sustained presence, and then the English. Some settlers developed partnerships with the indigenous people, and they took in their indigenous knowledge to help them survive when they landed in the New World and trying to figure out how to sustain their lives. The new arrivals also exchanged services and products based on a mutually beneficial relationship. So the Europeans would bring manufactured goods and items such as cauldrons or firearms, and the indigenous people provided food, survival skills, knowledge of the water of the land, and access to furs, which drove a lot of this relationship. So it was more mutual early on. But then changes came because these new people and new items were introduced, such as firearms. So that was new technology and had mixed impacts in the indigenous communities. And while some aspects were advantageous, there were challenges as traditional skills and knowledge started to become lost with dependence on the new technologies that came in. And that would eventually impact the health and well-being of the indigenous people. And I'm going to touch on this. So there was the doctrine of discovery, which was a European concept, along with another one called terra nullius, which in Latin means nobody's land. And these ideas were put forward as the Europeans came to the New World to explore as sort of a self-justification for reasons to take land and resources for themselves, that there was no one here, terra nullius. The idea was introduced by Pope Alexander actually in 1493 and held on for a long time. And it was used to include lands not seen as occupied by civilized, finger quotes, people, or being put to civilized use. And of course, the use that was civilized was of course judged by the new arrivals. Economic aspirations. So initially there were strong trade alliances with the new arrivals, which benefited from the First Nations knowledge of land and resources, but eventually it became predatory. New arrivals to Canada and really all of North America, they wanted, well, number one, land, goods, fur, timber, gold, resources, fishing and whaling, which were both very abundant and very profitable. As a result, there were forced relocations. We want this land. We're going to have you move here. There were treaties that were made, but the motivations for making those treaties, you heard how First Nations people, how Indigenous people looked at treaties and agreements. It was a different mindset with the Europeans and how they saw them. And there was a lack of understanding, whereas Indigenous people are looking at the future and 7 years on and what we say, this is good forever. There wasn't the same approach with the Europeans that came in. And so they would make treaties and then would break them in the future. So different view towards property, different views towards land. And they literally were not speaking the same language. And that lack of understanding led to the forced relocations and the seizure of land. Initially, there were military alliances between the First Nations people and the new arrivals, built for the same reasons as the trade alliances. And the First Nations people's expertise in military tactics that were suited to the land were advantageous. But and for a while, they actually worked together. There were conflicts where the colonists and First Nations folks did fight together in the War of 1812, in the 7 Years' War, rather. The result from both of them were strong, significant impacts over the indigenous populations, high casualties, and often loss of land and treasure. Along with conflicts came disease, and this is an old story. You've all heard this before. Smallpox, TB, scarlet fever, influenza, the measles, all brought over. And of course, we all know what happens when you don't have any exposure or resistance built up to disease. So, and then as time passed, and I'm moving very quickly through a couple hundred years of history, the combined impact of war and diseases and the disruption of traditional life, anything from hunting to food to spiritual beliefs and practices, disruption to education, to how their economies ran, to relationship of time and nature, created famine and social disorder across all indigenous populations, and they began to decline. Now, this talk is focused on the government impact with the Indigenous people of Canada, and now we're going to start getting into it with as the Dominion of Canada was established. Check my time. Okay. So, a royal proclamation was made by King George in 1763, and it set out specific guidelines for settlers that were coming to the New World. And it acknowledged the Indigenous people. It acknowledged that they existed before the arrival of the Europeans. Sounds a little bit different than what Pope Alexander said. And the proclamation never ceded or sold the land to the crowd. So it never incorporated the seizure of land. And it stated that Indigenous people were free to live on the land undisturbed according to their traditions, which is incredibly inclusive, forward-thinking, and progressive. It set out the ways in which the governments that were being formed could negotiate treaties on the lands occupied by Native peoples. And in doing so, that was an official recognition that these lands were also those of the Indigenous people. And essentially, the proclamation is considered First Nations to be political entities capable of having treaty conversations with the Crown. So it was very encouraging to everyone that this was put forward, but ultimately, this proclamation was not honored. So roughly 100 years later, Canada became a confederate country, basically became a country. So it was 3 British North American provinces. The province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick were brought together in confederation and called the Dominion of Canada on July 1st, 1867. So that's not really Canada's Independence Day, like we have an Independence Day, but it's our national day. So, and then the province of Canada was split into Ontario and Quebec. Canada was not fully established as a fully independent country since the United Kingdom retained legislative control over Canada and full control over foreign policy. So the British North American Act still comprises a big part of the Constitution of Canada, and it set the framework for the structure of government. But most importantly for this talk, it gave the government of Canada jurisdiction over, quote, Indians and land reserved for Indians in Canada. So it set out that the government of Canada was responsible to take care of the Indians, and it wasn't that of the province's responsibility. The English Crown was essentially just said, we have nothing to do with this anymore. It's like, you're setting up as an independent nation. We got our furs, we got our resources. You are now in charge of this, and the royal proclamation put out by King George, okay, then you are free to disregard that. And so it was under this authority and under the creation of the Dominion of Canada that the Indian Act was created in 1876. So let's get into this. So the Indian Act only impacted First Nations people, not Inuit and not Métis. And it gave a legal framework that permitted the government of Canada to control all aspects of the lives of First Nations people, socially, economically, politically, institutionally. And the first Prime Minister of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, stated that the Indian Act was never intended to protect the culture, language, or beliefs of the Indian people. He said in 1867, "The great aim of our legislation, the Indian Act, has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change." So in effect, it enabled human rights violations, trauma, social, cultural, political disruption for generations of First Nations people. So Indian status, which grew out of the Indian Act. And this is something I kind of struggle to understand, so hopefully I will break it down properly for you. It basically is government legislation that defines who is and who is not an Indian. I mentioned I'd be using these terms, and that's still the official term, and it's still called the Indian Act. So who has status? So if you are a registered or a status Indian, you were entitled to certain rights and certain benefits from the government of Canada. But the mechanism to define who you are also came from the government of Canada. So being a status Indian, you are officially registered on the Indian Register, which is a central registry with the federal government. Status Indians get a status card that has information about their identity, their band, and a registration number. They're basically wards of the government. It's a very paternalistic legal relationship that was established that basically illustrates the historical notion that the Indigenous people were like children that needed to be controlled and directed in a more civilized colonial way of life. So there are a number of ways that Indigenous people could lose their status or their rights to what the government was supposed to provide to them. So among these, if they went to school and graduated from a university, they were no longer entitled. So if you're educated, boom, rights are gone. You're not an Indian. If they became Christian ministers, which is interesting because religion is deeply tied into colonialism, you were out. If you attained a professional designation, such as a doctor or a lawyer, you were no longer Indian. If you served in the military, First Nations women and their children will lose their status if the women married men who were not Indigenous. So there are all sorts of pitfalls that they could fall into to extract yourself from being identified as Indigenous by the government, but also to the rights that you were given by the government. So the Indian Act controlled many aspects of Indigenous life. A big one is access to land, the reserve system. So First Nations had land set aside to live on, but ownership and control of the land remained with the government. And the reserve system was an effective way to control because, again, they wanted to control and assimilate. The band administration, so Indigenous local government, was also designated by the government how it was going to work. And in many cases, the government would send military or other traders, non-Indigenous, to work as part of the government as well. So self-government, but not really self-government. There are Indian agents. These were non-Indigenous government officials who were in charge of these different regions. So they would be the representatives on the reserves. Again, main goal is assimilation and solve this problem that was seen as the Indigenous people. And the Indian agent had a lot of power and the ability to sort of dictate how people in their area lived. They were judges, property surveyors, administrators. They would enforce attendance at Indian residential schools that I'll get into. They would control religious or cultural practices and could call a halt to some of them. They would decide how food rations were distributed. So you see the potential major problems that could arise out of this. They administrated the pass system. To leave reserve land, or you had to get permission from the Indian agent. So if you wanted to go see someone over there, you had to get permission from this government official to leave and come back. And the Indian agent would also see the flow of communal money. So money coming from Ottawa that comes to the reserve, go to the Indian agent, and they kind of administered it as they saw fit. So the Indian Act was updated multiple times over the years. It does still exist. Further restricting rights, and I listed some of them here. Right to vote, cultural customs, selling agricultural produce, no political organization, and you could not be a status Indian and a Canadian, which I'll just let that marinate for a little bit. It was shocking to me when I did this deep dive. Residential school system. So one of the parts of the Indian Act was the government took over the responsibility for education of the young people and also the desire to assimilate. So the first government school was opened in Ontario in 1831. So, and again, I'll go back to Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, first one of Canada. So he authorized the creation of the residential schools, mostly in the Canadian West. And the Secretary of State for the provinces at the time told Parliament, in order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people say this is hard, but we want to civilize them. If we want to civilize them, we must do that. So the school system was operated by either the government or by the Catholic Church, who was given government money to run the schools. And the explicit intent was to separate children from their family and their culture. And sometimes children would be taken by force. They were required to go to these. Some children would go and hide, and their families would try to hide them, and officials would go out and try to find them and take them from their homes. And we're talking little kids. We're talking 5, 6 years old who would go away to these schools. In 1920, the residential school attendance became compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 15. No choice, had to go, no matter what the situation was at home. These schools were underfunded and overcrowded. The students were not allowed to speak their own language, and they were punished if they did. And while most of them will be called residential schools, they often maintain industrial work through large gardens, barns, workshops, sewing rooms. So these kids were brought to a school, but then they were put to work. The children, and evidence has been coming out more and more over the years of what happened at these schools. Children were physically and sexually abused, starved, or even experimented on. There's no accountability to the staff. In 1958, Indian Affairs regional inspectors recommended the abolition of residential schools, but these schools continued to exist into the 1990s, not that long ago. Many children disappeared. Some ran away and were never seen again. Some just vanished. Their families never knew what happened to them. And on the grounds of residential schools across Canada and even in the United States, they're finding the unmarked graves of many of these children who never made it home. I said that the schools lasted until the 1990s. And so there is a lot of generational trauma among Native peoples that lives on today. Residential schools, as I mentioned, were also in the United States. There were 523 of them, and 4 of them are still operating in the United States today. I didn't know anything about US history until I did this lecture and put this together for you. So in 1923, nearly 83% of Native American children attended residential schools. And there were 2 in Missouri, 13 in Kansas, and 95 in Oklahoma. There's a lot of information out there about the residential school system, and I encourage you to look it up if you're interested in more. I shortened this in the interest of time. There is a film being shown next Tuesday called Bones of Crows, which talks a lot about Indigenous history in Canada, but does touch on residential schools and some of the things that happen there. I strongly encourage you to see that film. It's a tough one, but it's an honest one. Health and wellness. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So healthcare was the responsibility of the Department of Indian Affairs. So they were legally obligated to provide healthcare to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So now we're rolling them in. Instead, the services were funded by the government to medical facilities operated by churches, and the aim was to reduce costs and to contain disease, because we know that the diseases were still in the community that were brought over from Europe. There were a number of health crises on reserves and in the north, and Government of Canada introduced a health benefit program for First Nations and Inuit. It provides health care for registered First Nations people and recognized Inuit. There's been a lot of criticism, and it wasn't funded to the degree it needed to be funded. TB is a particular problem. Because of the loss of the hunting grounds, the bison slaughters, the military invasions and forced relocation, that resulted in poverty, malnutrition, and famine in Indigenous communities. And so diseases like smallpox and TB soared and created medical crises in the community. It was actually called Indian tuberculosis. And experts claimed that the infection rates were 10 to 20 times higher than in the non-Indigenous communities. And so in the 1950s, Government of Canada passed laws that gave police and medical authorities the power to seize, examine, and treat Indians who had infectious diseases. Seize. If they refused medical treatment, they were faced fines or imprisonment. And during these treatments, Indigenous worldviews and cultural practices were undermined. Indigenous people were denied contact with elders and traditional healers. New drugs, vaccinations, and surgeries were tested on Indigenous peoples without their knowledge or permission. And an unknown, at the same time, because once again, Indian problem is what the government was dealing with, an unknown number of Indigenous women were sterilized without their consent and against their wishes. Indigenous people were often brought to sanatoriums if they had TB that were far from home. Some patients passed away and their bodies were never returned to the communities. And many families, especially in the Inuit communities in the far north, were never even notified of the deaths. And the personal data of the Indigenous patients has also been used for years without their permission. Inuit had a bit of a different situation than First Nations people. They weren't included in the Indian Act. So increased trade with colonizers in the 18th century, the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company of Hudson's Bay blanket fame. They were in the Arctic. There were hunters and whalers in particular that came up. The Inuit people taught them how to live on the land, how to dress properly for the weather, how to travel safely. Along with that, the missionaries came and brought Christianity and a trade system which changed Inuit culture and lifestyle, also brought disease. European trade brought good things, manufactured goods, food and tools, but traditional ways declined. And then the American whalers arrived. The whales were overhunted, the caribou were overhunted, and habitat was disrupted in the north. And the north is, of course, very fragile. So in the 1890s, more diseases came and epidemics wiped out a huge amount of the population. Territory was lost to Alaskan Inuit and Europeans who moved in as trappers. There was a famine, which also reduced the independence of the Inuit and increased their dependence on outside trade. And for many years, the responsibility for Inuit affairs was transferred from one department to another or between the federal government and the provincial governments. It wasn't until 1924 that the Inuit were considered Canadian citizens, and then they lost their voting rights, which they regained in the 1950s. In 1941, the Eskimo disc numbers began. So every Inuit was given one of these discs with, first the government representatives replaced their names, and then they were given a number, and a card or this disc as a necklace or a tattoo had to be with them at all times to identify who they were to the government. And then in the 1970s, Project Surname was developed for the government to give Inuit last names that were easier for the rest of Canada to understand, disregarding their local language. That program did not last long. It was discontinued in 1978. In the 1950s, there were forced relocations of the Inuit to the high Arctic. You saw that map. They were living further south. The government moved them to the high north, and they were basically human flagpoles. As more countries were in the Arctic hunting and looking at the land, it was a way to say, no, this is Canada's and we're here. But with the traditional knowledge of where they were living, moving to the high Arctic, it's very different up there. And it separated families. An apology was issued in 2010, rather. Sorry, I missed a bit. So it's not only moved to the Arctic because of the transiting up there, but also it was during the Cold War and just reasserting rights. So that happened in the 50s, and then the apology was issued by the government in 2010. Residential schools, they were layered in as late as the 1950s. There were only 6 in the north. The young people were educated. They tended to be educated more in the villages. And then after the 1950s, the policy changed, and Inuit children were sent to residential schools in larger numbers and over tremendous distances. They didn't just build them up in the north. So they took these children and shipped them further south. So they were separated from their parents in some cases for years. There was some establishment of day schools and small hostels in various communities where the children could at least be with their families a couple times a year. Gonna cut this short. Métis, it's different than the others. They're not included in the Indian Act. They're connected through trade and family to European settlers, so it's just a different relationship. But they also weren't, they're considered, and I hate this term, but this is the term that is used, half-breeds. They weren't white, they weren't Indigenous. So they fell into sort of this no man's land. So as a result, they weren't given government support. They weren't submitted to the various policies that were so detrimental to the other populations. The creation of Métis Nation is a whole lecture in itself. They have a fascinating history. And I'm going to cut this short for lack of time. The big things that colonialism did to the Métis, there was the demise of the bison. I mentioned they were nomadic and dependent on the bison for lifeways. The bison disappeared in 1870 to 1880. So then they really moved into settlements. In 1915, they were forcefully displaced from their lands because Canada established some national parks. So there are no reserves for Métis, so they were just get out. There were and still are a disproportionate number of Métis in the foster care and welfare system. And again, not fully recognized as Indigenous for a long, long time. So now you have the problematic history and what we're doing for reconciliation. So over the years, many promises were made, but rarely respected. There has been progress. In 1982, the Constitution of Canada, among many things included establishing independence from Britain, was amended to confirm the existence and protection to Indigenous rights. So there was a new section that was added that includes treaty rights, which is an ongoing issue, or was an ongoing issue with the government, that different interpretations and misunderstandings existed, and that now meaningful and inclusive consultations with Indigenous peoples are crucial and mandatory. They have to be consulted. They have to have that right to self-determine their lands, their rights, and the relationship with the Canadian government. They have Aboriginal rights, the right of self-government, that Indian agents can't come up and tell them how to live on their land and how to allocate their resource. So they now self-manage the use of lands, fishing, hunting, harvesting. They have the rights to cultural protection, to express their culture, their spiritual beliefs. To title of the land, occupancy of the land, and the duty to consult. So, which is for public servants like myself, that we have a duty to consult and accommodate regarding any activity that can impact Indigenous rights. So it doesn't define the full set of Indigenous rights, and they're continuously being clarified and modernized through historic and modern treaties, government agreements, and court cases. For decades, many Indigenous communities fought for the rights to be acknowledged, and we're actively working forward to try to reconcile this relationship. In 2019, Métis got a little bit of a short shrift from me. Canada recognized the Métis right for self-governance. There's an ongoing relationship there. It's a little complicated to get into, but there is the Manitoba Métis Federation, which is recognized currently as the existing democratically elected government of the Manitoba Métis. Fun fact, to lighten it up a little bit. So the Constitution Act of 1982 was instituted by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, father of our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Truth and reconciliation. This has to do with the residential schools. So in the 1980s, former residential school students started to take legal action. And in 2007, the Indian Residential School Agreement Settlement was established. It recognized, importantly, the damage inflicted on Indigenous people. It was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history to date. And one of the elements of the agreement was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to facilitate recognition among former students, their families, and communities, and all Canadians. And in 2008, former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, offered a statement of apology to the former students and for Canada's role in the residential school system. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission spent 6 years traveling across Canada and heard from more than 6,500 witnesses who told their stories. They hosted 7 national events to engage the Canadian public, educate people on the history and legacy of the school system, and to share and honor the experiences of former students. And the formal report was issued in 2015. It's available online. There are 94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and to put forward reconciliation. And I want to play this video from, this is Chief Robert Joseph sharing his experience.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance. And from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have this shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, "Canada, you have committed cultural genocide," there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said, survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, "I'm sorry," and then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, "I'm sorry." Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that Truth and Reconciliation is Canada.
I wanted you to hear about truth and reconciliation in the schools from an Indigenous person in their own words, because I cannot do it justice. September 30th, yesterday, is National Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada. It's a federal holiday. Before it was made a federal holiday in 2021, September 30th was celebrated as Orange Shirt Day. And this is Philip Webstad. I have a short video on her. I am going to slaughter her nation's name, so I'm not even going to try. But she comes from British Columbia. She is Indigenous, Irish, and French. And she is going to tell you a little bit about her residential school story.
I was the third generation to attend the St. Joseph Indian Residential School. My grandmother took me to buy something to wear for my first day of school. I chose a shiny orange shirt. Once I arrived at the mission, they took my shirt and I don't have a memory of ever wearing it again. The impact of that year at the mission was the feeling that I wasn't worth anything, that I didn't matter, and I've done a lot of healing since then, and I know that I do have a right to be here just like anybody else. I was able to tell my orange shirt story for the first time. My story has become what it is today, and Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. My name is Phyllis Webstad. I'm Shawetm from the Kennequig Dog Creek First Nation in BC.
So Orange Shirt Day started in 2013. It's an annual event observed across Canada. National Truth and Reconciliation Day came in much later. So when we refer to it, we always do Orange Shirt Day first, Truth and Reconciliation afterwards. And it's an opportunity for meaningful discussion about the effects of residential schools and the legacy, the generational trauma it's left behind. The tagline for it is "Every Child Matters." And today I am honoring Orange Shirt Day with my own. I want to share the official design for this year, which was created by Aaliyah Batista, a student from Ponoka, Alberta. Indigenous women and girls. Starting with the Indian Act, Indigenous women have been disempowered and disenfranchised. Traditional social structures were destroyed, taking with it self-agency and societal roles for women. Indigenous women are affected by higher rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, higher unemployment, poor physical and mental health, and lack of housing. And they're 3 times more likely to be assaulted and victim of violence than non-Indigenous women. While they only make up 4.3% of the female population in Canada, they are 16% of the homicides. And a staggeringly high number of Indigenous women also go missing every year. This is also true in the United States. So Government of Canada is prioritizing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, LGBTQ, and Two-Spirit people. There was a national inquiry launched in 2016 and a report in 2019 released with 231 individual calls for justice directed at governments, institutions, social services agencies, and all Canadians. So it includes long-term education funding, health and wellness, creating safe and affordable transit and transportation services, because a lot of these women disappear on the road trying to get to where they need to get to. It's updated the criminal code. Native American groups in the United States are looking to Canada and this report to make their own efforts towards solving the problems in the US. May 5th is called Red Dress Day. It was created by Métis artist Jamie Black. And on that day, red dresses are hung to honor the women and girls who have been victims of violence, often abducted, assaulted, or murdered without adequate investigation or justice. So while efforts and progress is being made, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people continue to face social and economic challenges. It's hard to undo centuries of damaging policy. Some of them, poverty, government policies that have created barriers to economic development, investment, and education. Potable water. This has improved over the last 10 years. As of 2015, there were 270 communities that could not drink their water, and a lot of those have been addressed and raised. Housing. People in First Nations communities are 4 times more likely to live in crowded housing and 6 times more likely to live in housing that is in major need of repairs. Suicide. We've talked about generational trauma. Suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for First Nations youth and adults up to 54 years of age. There's a disproportionate number of Indigenous children in the child welfare system and in the justice system. So, and then missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we just covered. So I want to leave time for questions. So the relationship between Government of Canada and Indigenous Canadians is complex. Laws and policies are being reviewed on an ongoing basis to recognize the unique place that Indigenous peoples have in Canadian political and constitutional framework, and to be inclusive as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For the government, we have 10 principles, which is to help us build a relationship with Indigenous people based on partnership and recognition of rights. And these principles are a starting point to help achieve a future of non-discrimination, equality, and justice. And so these principles are for public service workers who are asked to take a broader perspective, to reflect on our biases and our knowledge gap, and to do what we can to renew and advance the relationship with Indigenous people. So this was just an introduction to the relationship between Indigenous people and the Government of Canada. And there is much that I didn't have time to share with you today, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to explore on your own. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have complex cultures, create amazing art, have served their country, and led their way in everything from environmental law to human rights. I mentioned next Tuesday, Bones of Crows will be screening. I want to leave you with Mary Simon. So again, she is the Governor General of Canada. On the right, they get to create their own coat of arms. And it's very distinctive. She has the Arctic fox on there. She has the owl. There is Inuktitut up at the top. Some of the fauna from the north at the bottom. And I wanted to close with a quote from her 2001 2001? No, it's got to be 2021. Speech from the throne. We know that reconciliation cannot come without truth. Reconciliation requires a whole of government approach, breaking down barriers and rethinking how to accelerate our work. Whether it is eliminating all remaining long-term drinking water advisories or implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the government is committed to closing the gaps that far too many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities still face today. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech, which means thank you in Algonquin. Questions?
If you have a question, let me bring you the mic, since this is also being shared on Zoom and recorded. Questions?
In one of your early maps, when you were showing the distribution of Indigenous peoples, it seemed like there were fewer in Quebec, and maybe that was just my look, but is there a reason for that, or can you say anything more about that?
Ooh, thank you. There's not only First Nations, but also Inuit in northern Quebec. And those maps broke up. I made a very distinct decision to try to identify each as separate peoples. So that first map did not loop in everyone. That was, I started with First Nations.
Other questions?
I threw a lot at you today, I'm sorry. It's very heavy, but it's truth.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for coming to our campus as part of the Native American Association. I say that Tijame is thank you in my language, the Wyandot. Actually, I think we were down there in Michigan. If at the beginning, so I like seeing my tribe up there. But as looking up into what United States can do from our Canadian brothers and sisters over there, what can we do to, if it's the recognition of the people that were, unfortunately at the residential schools, what can we do to kind of adopt that and put into legislation maybe? Or maybe you could hit on what as college students, what can we do to, make that happen, or basically kind of touch on what can college students do and what can the U.S. do?
Ooh, that's a lot. Okay, as a representative of the government of Canada, I'm not going to tell the United States what to do, even though I'm an American. I've very much got my Canada hat on today. Speaking from personal experience in my role, I have, our office, has helped connect U.S. Indigenous groups in, I worked with our colleagues in Minneapolis and with tribes in northern Wisconsin who are looking at MMIWG, about missing and murdered. I was able to connect them with the woman who headed up the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. And so it was during COVID, and we arranged for them to do a direct consult, and I sat in on that. And I can tell you, I think the conversation was very different because it was Indigenous people to Indigenous people, and she was very frank on what to do. So what Canada can do is help connect. I would like to say Canada is a little bit further down the road as far as truth and reconciliation than in the United States. The process is not perfect, but that collaboration and the knowledge is there, and that we can, like in our role at the consulate, we can help make those connections and build those bridges. As youth and students, like, you tell me. I'm sure there's students in Canada that are doing excellent work, and I'm happy we can talk and I can see if I can connect you. It's something that, we want to get in the middle of it. Like, we need youth to save all of us. But that collaboration, because it's the same issues on both sides of the border, right? The colonists came in, and neither country has treated their Indigenous people well, and problems continue. So let's talk offline.
Do you know, I know the human trafficking is something that come up in social media a lot a couple of years ago, and of course it was brought up again in the presentation. Do you know if there's been any sort of betterment over the last couple of years, like in a decrease in the human trafficking? Like, has there been any strides made to better that situation?
I don't have the numbers. I didn't look into that. I know the awareness of it seems to be raised. But as far as combating it, a lot of that comes down to local law enforcement taking these things seriously. But there does seem to be more movement in the state, at like a state level I'm seeing in the United States, and at the provincial level, that this is a major problem, and just trying to figure out how to address the causes and then the results of it. So honestly, I don't have the stats on me. And again, we just came through COVID, so I don't know how that impacted things. It's an ongoing issue. If the needle's moved, it's not dramatic.
The residential school system is certainly a fascinating topic, especially if you compare the two countries. Do you have any sense if it was better or worse in the United States than in Canada? Because we don't hear much about it in the U.S. either.
Well, I'll tell you, a lot of Canadians had no idea. Non-Indigenous Canadians had no idea of the scope and scale of residential schools. That's been an awakening of knowledge since I've been in this position, so the last 20 years. I don't know the scope and scale of the United States. I see mentions of it in the media every once in a while because my eyes are focused on Canada a lot of the time. But as far as awareness movement towards it, I'm not aware of anything along the lines of truth and reconciliation happening in the U.S. Like there has been this reckoning in Canada.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and all the research that you did in preparing for it. And
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Please get some of Earl's candy on the way out. They'll make you feel a little bit better.